Okay, let me read this text. This is a translation from Psalm 40 by an Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann. I'm going to post it for you. And there's a reason why I'm using this particular translation. Thou hast multiplied thy wondrous deeds and thy plans toward us. As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord plans for me. The Lord plans for me. The Lord goes before me. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but when you experience certain places or things that you go through, where you're sitting or where you're standing makes an entire difference as far as how you experience something. Like a few years ago, I was privileged to go to Haiti for a couple of weeks with the organization I was leading, and I got a chance to experience Port-au-Prince in a unique way. Throughout the couple weeks I was there, I moved from one area of the city to another. Fascinated with the culture and the arts that I experienced, being heartbroken by the devastation brought on by corrupt systems and natural disaster. I was able to get a certain view of the city, but I'm going to show you something else. One of the brothers that was carting us around the city took us on a little field trip. And I'm just going to show you this. This was on my phone, so it's very low quality. But I want you to catch. This is on a mountain overlooking Port-au-Prince. Go ahead, Ken. I wanted to put this on video because it was too broad to see with a camera. That's Port-au-Prince. And we are way, way up in the air on this mountainside. I don't know if you can see down here. It's a huge city. I wanted to put this on video because it was too broad to see with a camera. That's Port-au-Prince. And we are way, way up in the air on this mountainside. Obviously, I didn't have the best words for this, but you get the picture. The picture is this. If you're down in one of the neighborhoods, you're experiencing Port-au-Prince in a very specific way. But if you're standing on that mountain, you're seeing the vastness of this. It's a huge city. And the geography of Port-au-Prince is... I'm up here, I mean it. This is like breaking into a safe, trying to get the lights. Okay, don't touch it again. Getting up there, you see the vastness of the city, and it's a completely different picture than if you're walking around in a neighborhood. It's got this beautiful bay and so forth. And just so you know, if you're a friend of mine, you come to Spokane, I have a certain route that I take. Because people come into Spokane and they have certain assumptions, and I'll drive them around certain neighborhoods and show them the granular nature of our city, but then I'll take them up, I don't even know, I think it's Bernard or whatever, and you go up on the top and there's a bluff and you can pull your car in, and literally there's an overview of the entire city, and you can tell people how it's laid out and how it was intentionally constructed. So my point is, your vantage point dictates how you experience things. That's where I want to go today. The principle is displayed in our text this morning. It's a lectionary text from Genesis chapter 50. It's the tale of a guy named Joseph. And if you've read the story, which you probably have, he's a pretty notable person in the Bible, you realize that his life was very complex. As his father, Jacob's favorite son, he became the target of his brother's pettiness and envy. Jacob gifted Joseph a stylish jacket, which just amplified the intensity of their jealousy toward him. In a cruel move, I'm going to just do a little overview of the story real quick. In a cruel move, his brothers, being jealous and hating him, took him out to kill him into the remote area. But instead of killing him, they put him in a pit and they sold him into slavery. They sold him as an indentured servant. Now, I don't know what your experience with your bro is, or your family dynamics, but my guess is they didn't throw you in a pit and sell you to somebody else. He did not have a good experience with his brothers. By the way, he was 17 years old when this happened. He was a teenager. Many of the family's closest friends described them as a loving and deeply functional family. I don't know why I put that on there. I just thought, this family's messed up. A man named Potiphar purchased Joseph to work in his household. During that time, Joseph thrived and Potiphar prospered as well. However, if things weren't bad already, Potiphar's wife tries to entrap Joseph sexually and gets him arrested, and he's thrown in prison again, or thrown in prison. During the time in prison, Joseph used his gifts of dream interpretation to gain favor in Pharaoh's household and ultimately achieve personal success. Joseph was given a dream to interpret that showed both abundance and a hardship in the future of Egypt. He interpreted the dream wisely and realized that Egypt needed to prepare for a coming famine. And as a result of his insight, he was put in charge of managing the country through this famine, the impending hardship. Now, that's Egypt, where Joseph is now, but if you move back to where Joseph comes from, the famine was pervasive, and his family found itself in very difficult times as well. So Jacob, his dad, sends his brothers to Egypt for relief. Now, they did not know what was coming next. And I don't want to go into all the specifics of the story, but they get to Egypt, and the long and the short of it is they discover that the person that they hated, thrown in a pit and sold into slavery, was now over the entire country. Yeah, oops is right. They get there, and as soon as they find out it's actually Joseph, they fear for their lives. And in our chapter this morning, this is the end of Genesis, we find that Joseph's brothers, it says, are fearful because their father had just died. And really, they thought Joseph wasn't going to injure them while their dad was alive. But as soon as Jacob died, they knew their story's over at that point. So we find them in this very difficult situation. They're in massive shock, making them feel afraid and unsure about what would happen next. Genesis 50. With Jacob's absence, Joseph's brothers become functionally homeless. And the person that they once despised was the person that they had to answer to. And it was right for them to fear for their lives. After expressing their fear in the beginning, or the verse 15 of chapter 50, it goes through this little progression, and there's one particular section that literally arrested me as I was looking at this text. It's found in chapter 50, verses 19 and 20, and I'm going to read it. We'll project it for you right here. After expressing their fear to Joseph, it says, "But Joseph said to them," his brothers, "Don't be afraid. I am here in the place of God." Now, there's more to this text, as you can read for yourself, but I couldn't stop reading after that, because this is what happens with me when I read Scripture. I read something and I go, what does that even mean, to be in the place of God? I'd like to take just a few more minutes this morning and at least explore that, so that we can have an idea of what was going on with Joseph, and I think it actually applies to us as well. Don't be afraid, I'm in the place of God. Let me tell you the first thing. It doesn't mean that pain and suffering and trauma are to be minimized, avoided, or buried. That's not what it means to be in the place of God. Sometimes, as people of faith, admitting our shortcomings or pain or trauma, somehow in the church, that oftentimes gets equated with failure. How can you follow the King of Kings and the sovereign ruler of the universe and all-powerful God, come along and then talk about failure? Or how can you dare talk about depression or trauma or hatred. It probably doesn't need to be stated, but it's essential to acknowledge it, that Joseph didn't deny being injured by his brothers. That wasn't part of the story. Though he was forgiving, he never denied the trouble he went through. It was never like, it was no big deal. Don't worry about it. I just shook it off. Or, as Monty Python would say, it's only a flesh wound. That wasn't his story. They had harmed him, they had harmful intentions, and their motives were impure and ungodly. They despised Joseph and wanted him gone from their lives. Despite God's protection over Joseph, now listen, it didn't erase the wrongdoing. There still was harm, years and years of suffering that came at the hands of his brother's initial actions. Years in prison. It was real, and there was no attempt to candy coat it. I challenge you to read through Genesis and try to find a place where it candy coats the pain and suffering that Joseph went through. That's not what this text is about. That's not what it means to be in the place of God. I don't believe it. Just imagine for a moment the life that Joseph had lived that was catalyzed by the jealousy and the malicious actions of his bros. Being in the place of God doesn't mean you're bulletproof. Can I say that again? Being in the place of God doesn't mean you're invincible. That's not what it means. I'll be honest. The early days of me being a Christian, that's kind of the mentality or ideology I carried with me and was given to me. If you were in God's will, you were invincible. You were unharmable. I'd be, in essence, Superman. Believe it or not, people actually said those exact words to me. If you're in the will of God, you'll be Superman. No one can hurt you. When Joseph said that he was in the place of God, he was not saying that life was easy or that he was immune to hardship. The journey was far from easy. It was grueling and agonizing, even to the point, if you look at Psalm 105, verse, I think it's 6, somewhere right in there, it says they bruised his feet with shackles, his neck was put in irons. Some commentators actually contend that he was disabled while he was in prison, where he wasn't a whole person after he got out, physically. Despite his unwavering faith that God chose him, his siblings showed violence and vengefulness toward him, and he was eventually sold into servitude, falsely accused of rape, and imprisoned. Even after achieving success in Pharaoh's kingdom, he endured pain and suffering. His story may not have been easy, but he did actually understand something else. Before I get to that point, let me give you one other thing that it's not. Being in the place of God doesn't mean we get to be in the place of God. I know that maybe sounds redundant or weird or whatever, but let me explain to you how this works. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, as I was teaching from Romans chapter 12, you know, if Paul was on Twitter, we went through all these different examples of the pithy things that Paul would say. And one of the things he said was, don't overcome evil with evil. And in verse 17 through 19, he writes this, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. And then he says this. Now listen very carefully, church. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. Out of jealousy and envy, his brothers literally sold him into slavery. I mean, did you hear that? I mean, they sold him as a slave. I don't know about your family dynamics, but I think this one tops the list. Joseph had every right to be angry. Joseph had every right to hold a judge. As a matter of fact, I think he had every right to exact revenge. They did intend to harm him. And just because God chose to use him doesn't mean the harm was not real. The larger view of God, however, in his purposes, Joseph was able to break the cycle of shame, guilt, and dysfunction. Now listen, I want to try to make this as clear as possible. There are two places that God resides, that he occupies. One is judgment, and one is mercy. One is judgment, and one is mercy. I'm going to tell you, church, one of those spaces we don't get to be in the place of God. We don't get to occupy that space. You know the space we occupy? We are in the place of God in his mercy toward other people. God is the only one that gets to be in the place of judgment. Essentially comes along and says, I'm the one that occupies this space. By the way, I heard this last week: before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. One for the person you want to exact revenge on, and one for yourself. In Genesis, we can observe that Joseph had already forgiven his brothers, yet his brothers didn't believe him. They thought from the text that Joseph didn't kill them because of their dad. He was gone now, so they assumed their end had come. It's completely normal to think that he would exact revenge. It is a human condition. We've talked about this before, but think about how many vigilante movies there are. About every third movie is a vigilante movie, and you know what? We slurp that up like we can't get enough. Oh, okay, I do. I know you guys are way, way more advanced than I am and way more spiritual. But apparently someone's watching them because they keep making them about every third movie. Revenge is a human condition. Listen, injury begets injury. Violence begets violence. They injured Joseph in an unmeasurable way. They did violence to him that played out over his entire life. But here we are, Joseph, anticipating their fears, tells them what? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And here's the question. Why? Why does he tell them not to be afraid? Because there was something else being played out in their midst. Joseph could see the larger narrative at this point and recognize that though his brothers were petty and hurtful, God was up to something else. They intended evil, but God meant it for good, it says in our text. He turned beauty for ashes. He gave them the oil of joy for mourning. He gave them the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. Since the Garden of Eden, this has been a problem for humanity. In the fall, this is where this started. Think about this for a minute. If you've read the Genesis narrative at the very beginning, the creation narrative, God explains to Adam and Eve that there are 2 trees. One, the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you know what God says? You can participate and partake of the tree of life. You know what that was? That was the tree of God's shalom. That was the tree of God's love. That was the tree of God's mercy. And by partaking in that, you would live into the most grand, beautiful existence that could happen. But then God forbade them one tree, one thing in the garden. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why? We have to ask the why question again. Because he says, once you do, you'll be like God. Another follow-up question. How will they be like God? How will we be like God? They would be like God by sitting in the wrong seat. By sitting in the seat of judgment. By sitting in a place where it's my job to exact the revenge. Now, everybody in this room has been hurt, right? We've been hurt, betrayed, compromised in some way by somebody else. There's pain and suffering in the world. We all have gone through things. There's not one person in this room that's had just like this straight line through life. That's just not the way it works. What happens, though, is something happens to us, and we think that we have it within us to judge rightly. We can actually get it right. That we are righteous enough to judge. It's kind of like this. Raise your hand if you've ever, well, maybe even this week. Raise your hand if you've checked how much the Powerball is this week. It's a lot. It's like, I think it's about 600 million right now. And I'll tell you the truth, I've looked at it and I figured it out with the amortized approach. And it works out to be about $15 million a year. Just so you know, I know you guys don't look at this either, but I've looked at it, and then I have heard story after story about people who win these lotteries, and almost without exception, people that win go into the weeds. I mean, their life gets really crazy, and they don't handle it well. But I'm going to tell you something right now, that I can be trusted with that dough. This is how it works. I figured it out this last week. 15 million, all divided into 4 allotments, and 25% I'll give away immediately. Just give it away. This church could benefit from that. I would. I'd give maybe half. But then I started thinking, well, if I took 5% off that 25% and added it to index fund, I could multiply that money and make more money. As a matter of fact, if I took 5% more off, and you know, by the time I'm done thinking about it, I'm actually using it all for myself. And I proved that I cannot be trusted. I'm just like everyone else. I want to tell you, if you think you are adept enough to make judgments on other people, you're just like me with the lotto. You're fooling yourself. I mean, I'm again, remember my first point? We're not minimizing pain, trauma, or hurt. That's not what the story tells us. But if we think we can get it all right, we have been deluded. Doesn't mean justice doesn't need to happen, but I'm saying in the story of Joseph, there's something else going on. 1 Samuel chapter 16 says this: the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at what? The heart. The heart. Listen to this. We have to understand that being in the place of God means many things, but it doesn't mean we get to sit in the seat of judgment. It just doesn't. And when we do, some of you guys are old enough to experience it when you do. Number one, it doesn't make it better when you sit in that seat, and it usually ends up with hurt begetting hurt, violence begetting violence, and next thing you know, you're dropping a bomb on somebody. It's really the way this whole story works out. We cannot move into that seat. Stay in the seat of the tree of life. Yes. And with Paul, we can say this: I'm going to leave a lot of the stuff in that lane because that's not my lane to live in. I'm not supposed to live in the lane of revenge. And I know that sounds, I hope it doesn't sound heartless or that I don't care about trauma. Obviously we do. That's not the point. The point is, where does this lead us if we think we're going to move down this other lane? It doesn't resolve anything. You might think it does, but it won't. I guarantee you it won't. Maybe you're thinking right now, you don't know what's going on with my life right now. Well, you don't know what's going on with my life either. You don't know that there are hard things going on everyone's life that you want to exact revenge over. And see, in the larger narrative, Joseph could see that though he had the power to judge, it was not his to exact. Okay, let me give you one other point, and this is one in drive forward. It means that Joseph had a vantage point to see a larger story working out. At this point in the story, he could see what God was doing. Being in the place of God, as the text says, allowed for a different narrative. He could see life from a grander, a larger narrative or perspective. Like me standing on the mountain above Port-au-Prince here that I showed you a moment ago, vantage changes everything. Joseph could see the larger narrative at this point in the story. Joseph recognized that there was something else in the balance, that there was a redemptive story being played out that was God's and, ready? And Joseph was chosen to join in the story. This is where it becomes redemptive, church. It's a story that we get invited into. As we look at the entire corpus of Scripture in the New Testament, that is what happens when we understand the larger story, which we have the privilege of doing by reading Scripture. We know that things are going somewhere. This is not a story that is terminal. One of the most powerful theological concepts for me is this idea of telos. Telos literally means the ultimate object of something or the ultimate aim of something. Joseph, realizing the ultimate aim of God, changed how he interacted with his circumstances. What was in the balance? If you can you shoot that text back up there? You can see what's in the balance in this story, right? This is, but Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid, I'm in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Why? To accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. In other words, salvation. There was salvation to be had, and it wasn't just for Joseph's family, and it wasn't just for Egypt, it was for all who were present. Everyone participated and enjoyed what was going on. I've said this so many times, I probably should stop, but I'm not gonna. That this idea of telos, this idea of hope and the promises of God for the future define the way we are to live today. When we talk about the new heaven and new earth, it's kind of like, I was never very good at math, but it's like an equation in my head where whatever I see described in the new heaven and new earth, what I do is I go, that's my job to live into that. Now, the vantage point we see and can observe changes the way we act with the circumstances we go through, with the raw material or data that we're engaged in on a daily basis. Amen. New heaven and new earth. No more tears, no more judgment, no more crying, no more... things are to be righted. In other words, salvation, healing, shalom. All of those things that, honestly, at the deepest part of who you are, church, that's what's there. God put that there as the magnet for your soul. That's what you long for, whether you know it or not. It's not all of these different circumstances like, man, if I can win the lottery, or if I can get Gonzaga tickets, or whatever. It's the righting of all things, putting all things to rights, and that defines who we are. And for Joseph, it defined things. It changed the way he looked at this thing. He could have been as bitter as anybody could imagine. But because he realized he was part of a larger narrative, he didn't exist or remain in that place. He didn't go there and stay. I know for sure he was like us. He had to struggle. But because of this additional data, he did have a different way to approach it. Joseph partnered with God in his redemptive plan of reconciling all things. And this is for us, church. We get to enter into that narrative or that grand story of God as well. If God is real, the story is true, there's no more resplendent place to exist than in the place of God, where Joseph existed. Not a bulletproof life, but one that is full, that is abundant, and visionary, that frees us. Being in the place of God means that we get to join God in his redemptive plan for not only the given circumstances of life, but also participating in the overall redemptive venture that God's a part of. That is sometimes I think we just get this church thing so messed up. We think church is a hospital just to make you all feel better. And we all want to hug, and we'll hug each other, and we'll feel better. But that's not the telos. It's not just so we can get our bellies rubbed. The events that unfold in our text today, church, are all part of God's redemptive and salvific work, and Joseph ultimately becomes the one who brings relief and sustenance to both Egypt and Israel during a time of famine. Through it, we see the guiding hand of God. It is not a stretch biblically that each of us gets to play a role as well in the present. It doesn't matter what your stature is, doesn't matter what your gifting is. It doesn't honestly, that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is our heart toward God and whether we're willing to enter into the privilege of being a part of that story. I'm going to say this. There's really a lot of smart people in this room, and you've been exposed to a lot of things. But I had a conversation with a guy who was a philosopher at a Starbucks one time, and I won't tell you any more details beyond that. Some of you might even know this person. But he comes from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, and we got into this conversation. Actually, no, he actually is Roman Catholic. And he made this statement, and this was in an era in my life where being right was very important. And he wasn't beyond arguing. So he made this statement about Mary, that she was a co-redemptress. And in my conservative theological world, I went, foul! You can't say that. Jesus is the only Redeemer. You can't stick Mary in that story like that. You know what? I think I believe it now. Not just Mary, though. I believe Leslie's in that role. I think Dave's that person. I think all of us get to participate. And I'm not saying, when I say we're in the place of God, that we're that, him. I'm just saying we get to co-labor in this thing. It is scriptural. It's not just for one person, though. For everyone in this room. Everyone. We get to be co-participants in the story. I'm not saying it in sense that God is needy or thwarted by our unfaithfulness. That's not what I'm suggesting. But we are gifted or graced to play. One of my favorite things, and I'm going to close with this. I need to close quicker. Look at that time. One of my favorite statements by one of my favorite theologian missionary people is a guy named Leslie Newbegin. And he says, the church is not to be defined by what it is, but by that end to which it moves. You want to try to figure out what the church is about? Let's think about what the end looks like, and let's start forming our community to that. Amen? Maybe another way to put it is we're able to live into God's great purpose by allowing our lives to be defined by what is coming. I can say this with all honesty. I've been slighted. I've been injured by other people. I've been betrayed. I've experienced directionlessness. I can hold all of those things in a couple of different ways. I can take that circumstance and go, that is going to define everything, or I can take that and realize that even those things, again, I'm not purporting that we're supposed to celebrate hardship, but God is a redeemer. Realizing that there's a larger story in my life and your life. We're going somewhere, and it's incumbent on us, on the church, instead of reactive fear or resisting, to join the full story of God. You and me, the church, are participants in the loving, gracious movement of God toward his ultimate salvation. Amen? Can I have you stand, please? Would you guys be willing to sing with me before I let Bennett let us loose? You guys know how the Lord's Prayer goes, right? Let's try to sing it. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the glory and the power forever.